1 year ago, we explored the period in Superman history from 1986 to 1993 in our series Crisis Till Death. Now, the podcast returns to the Triangle era as we survey the post-Death and Reign landscape in comics, toys, video games, and television. This is Death Til Wedding, a new 7-part epic covering 1993 through 1996. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is Death Til Wedding Part 2, and joining me to discuss the Triangle era immediately following Reign of the Superman is one of the hosts of the Dollar Bin Bandits podcast and a first-time guest on this show, Joe Marcello. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. You and I know each other from our old comic shop, the late, great Alternate Realities in Scarsdale, New York.
Yeah, absolutely. I still remember the first day I met you because I pulled up to the shop and I saw someone outside who had a Superman vanity plate on their car. And as a Superman fan, I'm like, what the hell is this? Who's this guy? And then I come to find it was you. And I'm like, oh, well, that's obviously okay. So, it was cool. And then I guess, it's such a small world. You come to find that we all know the same people in different circles, and here we are.
Yeah, it's so funny. This must have come up at some point on the podcast, but I can't remember. Maybe in our Origins episode at the very beginning. But yeah, audience, I used to have vanity plates that said Last Son. Mm-hmm. Of course, in reference to Last Son of Krypton, although I would constantly get questions about whether I was the youngest son in the family. I was like, no, I'm the only son. I'm the only child. But yeah, I used to have those, and I don't have them anymore. When I ultimately parted with the leased car, because we had leased cars for a while, and each time, I kept that going. And then I said goodbye to those plates, and I do still miss them sometimes. And sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I should see if I can get it again. Maybe at some point I will. It was fun. I had fun having those.
I have those internal battles with myself. I'm like, should I get vanity plates? Should I do it? Should I bite the bullet? And I'm like, you know what? I've had the same plate for so long. It took me that long to memorize it. Like, I'm with it. So,
yeah. Well, it was fun while it lasted, and I'm glad that, it was something that we could bond over. I definitely remember you being in the store. I don't know that, I can't remember us having very long, involved conversations. I feel like they were usually quicker exchanges up at the register.
In passing, like, hey, this was issue, whatever is cool. And it was just really light and stuff like that. I didn't want to be that guy and be like, so what's up? He's some creep weirdo in the shop. But it was cool, man. I miss those days. I'll be honest with you.
It was, well, look, I have a whole other podcast if people want to explore that. It's called My Comic Shop History. But it was a very formative experience for so many of us. And yeah, I'm glad that we could meet through there. I'm glad we could have you on here. Like I said, you're one of the hosts of the Dollar Bin Bandits podcast, available on all major podcast platforms and in video form on YouTube as well. You guys, not too long ago, celebrated 100 episodes, so congrats on that.
Thank you.
And for anyone who hasn't checked it out, you guys interview true legends and veterans in the comic book industry, and it's fascinating. And it's especially relevant here because you've had on your show a number of the Superman creators whose work we're going to be talking about, including Dan Jurgens and Karl Kesel, John Bogdanove. It's amazing.
It was when, we started this journey, it was Oren and I, and obviously eventually Mike, but it was, in the middle of the pandemic, and the two of us were just itching to do something to stay creative because, like most of us, we were just in a funk. And he's like, hey, because we had discussed wanting to do a podcast in the past about kind of anything that came to mind, horror movies, wrestling, and comics came up. So he just approached me. He's like, hey, you want to start a podcast? We can do it. I'm like, all right. And he goes, well, we can use Zoom because we were doing those, as they were called back in the early days of the pandemic, drunken Zoom. So we would sit and chat and drink and BS for a while. So we started to use Zoom for a good purpose, and it kind of took off from there. And, it was really Oren's brainchild. He wanted to, just create something out of a passion of ours. And, early on, we're like, all right, well, I figured we'll get a couple of people here and there, and we would kind of make up the rest as we go. But then it turned into, we were text people, each other, hey, how about this person? How about that person? And, it literally came out of Oren and eventually Mike just reaching out to people and asking them very nicely, hey, we have this podcast. Do you want to be on it? And, little did we know that most of these creators are very willing to do so, to talk about their careers and the comic book industry and, where things are and where they've gone. So it's been a great experience.
Awesome. Well, I love what you guys do. I hope people will check out the show, generally, and especially with respect to episodes featuring these legendary Superman creators. And
yeah.
I can, that's the thing. I can understand why they would welcome the opportunity, because I think, unfortunately, especially when you're talking about these veteran creators who, have been around for a long time, a lot of times the focus is on the new hot up and coming writers, right? And those who've been around for a while, maybe they might not get the spotlight. So to have an opportunity to do something like this, I think people are always, flattered and interested, right? When there's, an interest in showcasing them and their work. And so the fact that you guys create this forum for them to recount their histories and shed some light on stories that they've worked on, I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was great being a huge Superman fan. And, for anyone who hasn't heard it at this point ad nauseum, but, the thing that got me into Superman was the Death of Superman storyline. And I just fell in love with, Dan Jurgens and the artwork and the writing. And for me, to actually speak to him and pick his brain about Death of Superman, which, let's be honest, at this point, anyone who's into comics and who's kind of in the know of that world, they know everything that's led up to it, what created it. We weren't breaking new ground necessarily, but to hear it from the mouths of the people that were instrumental in creating it was a whole different experience.
That's really cool. It's funny because as the audience knows, I typically don't do creator interviews on the show, with the exception of having Mark Waid on to talk about Birthright, which was so fun. But yes, of course, the thought has crossed my mind, especially as someone like yourself who got into comics and Superman with the Death of Superman, to interview Dan Jurgens or some of these other folks if they would be willing to come on. So it's definitely crossed my mind. We'll see. I think exactly what you spoke to is somewhat of my reservation, where I would only want to do it if I felt like I had something new to ask or to bring up.
Yeah.
Because it's been covered well by folks like yourself and other interviewers. So we'll see. But that's definitely something for anyone who's like, hey, what have you thought about it? Yeah, of course I've thought about it. We'll see. Maybe at some point we'll get there. But in the meantime,
yes,
this is part 2 of Death Til Wedding. Now, last time we talked about Superman Doomsday Hunter Prey, as well as the Doomsday Wars. So we looked at a pair of those Dan Jurgens miniseries that dealt with the return of Doomsday. And we had a great time talking about it, but now we are firmly back in the Triangle era here. And this is an interesting spot for me, because when we did our Crisis Till Death event last year, most of what I was reading was new to me. That was one of the largest gaps in my fandom. I started with the Death, but all the years leading up to it, I had not read before. So when we did that last year, that was a huge gap that I was closing, but it was all new to me. Now, we're in that stretch where I remember going to Heroes World in the Galleria Mall in White Plains.
Oh my goodness.
And of course, then later, Alternate Realities and other shops in the Westchester County area. I remember getting these comics. I remember reading them. So it's a little different experience this time around. Let me give folks a quick rundown of exactly what we read. So this was like a 40+ issue reading assignment. So I thank you very much. You're now in the category of guests, along with Scott Honig, who last year when we did Crisis Till Death had like three 50-issue reading assignments in a row.
I'm just going to hold this up, and I know you can't, most people won't see this. There's a list of that someone compiled on Reddit of all the issues, the Triangle issues, in the period that we're going to be discussing. That they put them in order, and it goes between Superman, Action Comics, Man of Steel, Adventures of, and they just put them in order in all the Triangle numbers. And it made it so easy for me to go back and just be like, oh yeah, and just read through it. So
I love it.
If you guys want to find it, it's out there.
I love it, and I thank you for taking on that reading assignment. I really do appreciate it. So
it's my summer reading.
Awesome.
Which I never did in school.
Yeah, see, this is fun homework. So Adventures of Superman 506 through 516. So Adventures was written by Karl Kesel and drawn by Barry Kitson. I had totally forgotten that Barry Kitson had a stint on the Superman books. So
yeah,
it was a pleasant surprise to me. I was like, oh, he did. Tom Grummett did the issue 506. That was sort of tidying up some of the Reign of the Superman business. And then I guess he and Kesel were off doing the Superboy series, and Barry Kitson came on for the remainder of the issues that we read for this. Then we have Action Comics 693 through 703, drawn by Jackson Guice and written primarily by Roger Stern until he left with issue 700, and then was succeeded by David Michelinie. I looked up a YouTube video where he said his name because I wanted to make sure I had the pronunciation correct. So it's Michelinie as far as I understand it.
Yeah, yes. So I in line with that, all these years I thought it was Karl Kesel, and it wasn't until we were talking to, I think it was it was either Dan Jurgens or Tom Grummett, who said it was Karl Kesel. And we were frantically texting each other, Oren and I and Mike, back, kind of behind the scenes, like, holy crap, it was Kesel this whole time. So, yeah.
Well, I think I talked about this in the Wade episode, but, before we started recording, I just wanted to confirm with him the pronunciation of his artist on Superman Birthright. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, it's Lineal U, according to Mark Wade, but out of all of the different permutations of what the pronunciation would be, it wasn't that, so I'm glad I asked. So yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
So that's Action Comics. Man of Steel number 28 through 37 by Louise Simonson and John Bogdanove. That's another name that I learned how to pronounce fairly recently. Yep. And Superman 84 through 93, primarily written and drawn by Dan Jurgens. There are a couple of fill-in issues along the way, but primarily Dan Jurgens. So those are the issues we read. As always, I like to start with the big picture question for you is how did you? I know this was not the first time that you were reading these. I know you read them, I guess, back in the day. I don't know how often you've revisited them, but I guess I'm just curious how they held up for you and what your overall impressions of this reading project were.
It was great to get back into it because it reminded me at the time how easy it was to jump on board because of the triangle numbers. Because you have 4 separate Superman titles, which you could read each one of the titles on their own. They would fall, they have their own storyline. However, if you read them, with all the triangles in succession, you have the bigger picture or the bigger story arc that also, falls in line in completion. So I found it very easy, to kind of get back into this, which reminded me of how easy it was for me to get into reading comics back in the day because of that. I was, like I said, I started reading Death of Superman. That's what got me into comics, but it wasn't until it was like a couple of years after this storyline had actually happened. So I'm playing catch up at this point. So to play catch up and not know what happened and where to go, the triangles made it so much easier. So when they got rid of that, I was like, oh man, not that I couldn't follow what was going on at that point, but still it was a feature that I think a lot of people, really kind of appreciated. And once it went away, of course, a couple other titles went away too. So it really wasn't that hard to follow, but I really, as a fan, I that's what I kind of, it got me into it, really hooked me.
Gotcha. As far as overall impressions go, how do I put this? I wanted to like this more than I did. And that's not to say that I disliked it or anything like that. Overall, I enjoyed myself going through these issues, but I wanted to enjoy them more than I did. I would say that I too like the triangle number system. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there were a couple of instances where I found that things were getting very repetitive. I think most notably, one of the main threads in the early issues that we read is that Superman's powers are increasing. Right? He was restored at the end of Reign of the Superman at Engine City, and he initially he's back at full power, but then he's finding that his powers are even above where they had been before, and it's like issue after issue of an example where he punches harder than he meant to, or expends more heat vision than he meant to, and it just kind of goes on for quite a while. And I think what I was bumping up against was because I really had such a great experience reading the stories that built into the Death and Reign and the Death and Reign themselves. And I felt that, I don't know. I don't know if I'm just kind of like looking back and it's like rose-colored glasses on last year's reading assignment or what, but I feel like those earlier Triangle era stories, I think did a better job of avoiding that, and also of sort of weaving together more subplots utilizing the supporting cast. I felt like a lot of the supporting cast kind of got lost in the shuffle a bit in the stories that we read. There are exceptions, but not to the extent that we had gotten before. So I think there was a little bit more repetition in a couple of instances where I was starting to wear on me a little bit. And I didn't feel like the supporting cast was utilized via subplots to the effectiveness that they were before. And then finally, my last big picture takeaway, when you look at the stories, the storylines that we read for this, there's the death. I mean, this was, we'll talk about it, but gut wrenching. The death of Cat Grant's son, Adam, the murder at the hands of Toyman. We have this 3-part arc called Spilled Blood, featuring a new racist iteration of Bloodsport, another character called Bloodthirst. We have the battle for Metropolis and the fall of Metropolis. I mean, listen, if you were offended by all of the destruction in Man of Steel, the storyline is not for you. It's destruction porn. Take it to the next level. We have a 2-parter with an alien character named Massacre, who comes to kill Superman. All of that is to say, I wasn't offended. I wasn't sitting there, it wasn't a clutching my pearls situation, but I'm reading these stories and especially reading them all together. And that was actually a question from one of our patrons, Brian. So shout out to Brian, who asked, how did the experience compare reading it all in one chunk versus reading it weekly? And I gotta say, man, I don't know that reading it in one chunk necessarily helped. Like especially all those things that I just mentioned, it really created an overall vibe that I don't know if you just chalk it up to the 90s or what, but that made an impression.
I agree with you 100% on that because, out of the gate when I started rereading this, we have the Toyman storyline, and that's heavy. That's serious. And then you follow that up with, and I don't know if I got the order correct. It was Toyman and then Bloodsport, but both of them are very seriously heavy topics, and I enjoyed those two because they're kind of real. You're taking a real topic and you're putting it into a superhero story. And I think even aside from the fact that you have your main character who could fly and punch through mountains and things like that, those storylines in and of themselves are very compelling. Now you jump from that to, clones at Cadmus Project that are getting sick and dying. I can certainly see, where you can bump into those because if you're going to be charting this on a chart, that line's going up and down because you have some certainly high points and there are definitely some low points. And I think that probably that's best consumed on a, weekly or monthly basis, because like you said, to consume this all in, a shorter amount of time, it doesn't do it justice because, you have that other storyline freshly in your mind. And they're like, so I'm going from this to this, really? And I think the same holds true for the artwork too. It's a little jarring. You go from some very clean artwork of one artist to another that is a little bit rougher just because that's their style. Some of whom I'm not a major fan of. And, it doesn't do the story any justice either.
So I agree with all of that. And I want to say on the art front, because I know when you had John Bogdanove on your show, I know you mentioned this sort of in the preamble to the interview, that, historically you were not the biggest fan of his style. And I've said the same on the show. I mean, I remember as a kid, as a little kid reading these, his always stood out, and not necessarily in a favorable way. Now, though, I do appreciate what he was doing and how distinct it was. Is it still necessarily what I think of as Superman when I close my eyes? No, but again, I can appreciate what he was doing. I will say, I think the most pleasant surprise in all of this for me has been Jackson Guice, because if you had asked me a couple of years ago, like, close your eyes and picture, renditions of Superman from the Triangle era, of course, Jurgens would come to mind. Of course, Bogdanove, for better or worse, Gromit, who's remained a favorite of mine for forever. Yeah. And I think Guice just kind of got like lost in the shuffle, or didn't cement in my young mind. But now as I'm reading these issues, I'm like, oh my God, this stuff is gorgeous. So that's been a delight for me to kind of go back and see all of that. But I agree with what you said, and about, sort of going from one story to the next here, and how sometimes it is a little bit jarring. And I think that the Toyman issues in particular, because, Jurgens is the one who's primarily handling that. And there's the death of Adam Grant in one issue of Superman, and then there's the 3-part Spilled Blood arc. And then we sort of get a follow-up with Cat Grant. So I do think that's something that would have benefited by sort of telling that story in succession, as opposed to, splitting it up like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as far as the Toyman and Adam Grant of it all, I mean, let's talk about it, because this is something that I remember reading as a kid. And, this is, late 93, 94. So I'm like 6 or 7 as these are coming out. I mean, I remember, I wasn't traumatized by it, but I definitely remember being like, whoa.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And of course, now for both of us as fathers, it hits totally differently.
It hits way different now, because I think we could probably recall similar instances in the news. And I say that of, children gone missing and, being found dead and whatnot. And to, as a, when we were kids reading this, none of that was even a thought. Of course, you heard stuff like that in the news, but you're looking at it through different lenses. And now to see, first of all, the cover of that issue, that initial issue, is just creepy, and the Toyman is not the Toyman that, it's a darker iteration of the character than we've seen over the years. There've been more goofy versions, which after reading this, I'm like, let's bring the goofy guy back, but yeah, it was a little difficult. And, obviously I knew where it was going, and to finally get to that, I'm like, wow, really? They did that, huh? And it made for a great story. But I was like, wow, I forgot how serious and dark a Superman comic could get.
Yes. I kind of remain split on it, because it's a real punch to the gut. Yeah. And from Superman's perspective, right? He's on vacation in this issue, right? And he even says to Lois that he, because he whisks her away, and he even says, like, don't we deserve this? Like, he literally uses the word, like, don't I deserve this? And that's a different color on the character. And I don't necessarily mind that, because I think it is a very human impulse, especially after everything. He literally just gave his life for the world. Absolutely. So, the idea that he might feel that way, I thought was interesting to explore. And then the fact that, he comes back and he hears the news. And we talked about this in the last episode, because the Doomsday Wars, which was in the late 90s, and I know you're familiar with the story, but, that dealt with, with this, with this business and Clark's guilt over not being there for him. And that's why he was trying so hard, in part why he was trying so hard to save the baby of Pete Ross and Lana Lang. So, from the Superman point of view, I think it gives us, territory to explore. I think about it in terms of the character of Cat Grant and what it puts her through. And again, as the reader, especially now as a dad, I mean, I was not looking forward to this. Like, I knew this was coming, and I was kind of dreading it, because I'm like, oh my God. And, and what's coming. And when you read the story, and they're at this birthday party. Jimmy is dressed up as the turtle and all of that. And, and Toyman approaches in his dinosaur disguise and he lures Adam away. I mean, it's horrific. It's really sickening. And, again, especially from that perspective as a parent, it really hits differently. I think where I was disappointed by these stories is shortly after Adam's death, there's the funeral, and Kat is approached by Ira Green, the father of Sasha Green, the karate instructor that Lex II killed in an earlier batch of stories that we talked about last year. And he approaches her as a parent, as a fellow parent who had to bury a child, the most horrific thing. And he approaches her and asks for help, right? Because the official story that Lex has put out, right, is that she moved to Coast City, and then of course Coast City was obliterated. So it's a convenient excuse. And so he approaches her. And I think that if the story had followed Kat's investigation, if Kat had looked into this, I know she's not typically that kind of journalist, but she could be.
Right.
Then I feel like we get more mileage out of this and there's more of a payoff. But instead, she immediately hands it off to Lois. And Lois has a great arc. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Lois's arc in these issues where she's working to take down Lex II and she uncovers the fact that he's actually Lex I. It's great for Lois. But it's like, if you're going to put Cat Grant through this, why not give her this story and follow it through? I thought that was very curious.
I agree with that because I've been reading it, and that same scene you're referring to, she basically says like, look, we're here at the funeral of my son. I need to work through this grief. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm going to get back to you. Okay. And I'm going to help you with this, but I'm going to get back to you in like a week or whatever it is. And we jump, another issue or two ahead, what have you. And Lois is on this beat now. And again, I agree with you. It didn't make sense. It would have definitely made for a better story and more powerful story arc for Kat, for her to follow through on it, in conjunction with her battling, or them alluding to her battling some demons of her own. The depression. Apparently she was drinking or not drinking. The bottle was there; it wasn't opened. There was a gun in the drawer, but it wasn't loaded. That type of stuff. So, they're alluding to these issues that she has, and she's dealing with her grief. But if she were to turn that grief around, turn a negative into a positive and use that anger or grief to fight for someone else, it would have really made for a better story arc for her. And again, like you said, Lois is the investigative reporter. That's her thing. But for Kat to do it, I think it would have been made for a better story in that sense.
I mean, you can't help but wonder, was there not room to have them investigate together or something like that? Like, I feel like I really think this was a missed opportunity here. And I think it did Kat a disservice. I mean, she does have this moment where Vincent Edge, right, her boss at GBS, I mean, it's really gross. I mean, he even says to her, like, "Oh, I guess we don't have to worry about finding a babysitter now, right?" Like, it's that's the territory we're in. And he eventually gets his comeuppance. We don't see much follow-up or any follow-up to this in the issues that we read, but Kat goes rogue on one of her broadcasts and mentions that she and other female employees at GBS are coming forward with accusations against Vincent Edge. So, she has that piece of it going on as well. But yeah, I just feel like that was a missed opportunity. And going back to what you were saying before about the Toyman, how you prefer the kind of the lighter Toyman. Jeff Johns heard you loud and clear, baby. So I'm I'm assuming you've read that Action Comics issue, right, from the Jeff Johns run that I'm referring to.
I'm sure I did, because Jeff Johns is just amazing in my view.
Where he retcons this.
Yeah. So there were a few toy men. There was Toyman, and then there was a Toyman who was the little boy who was just super rich and smart and built, like Superman, Batman robots and stuff. So, but yeah, I don't remember which one specifically that Jeff Johns was referring to. So
this was one of the issues that was like, it was a one-off sort of in between his, he did Last Son of he did the Last Son arc, he did Legion of Superheroes, the Brainiacs. This was a one-off sandwiched in between a couple of those arcs. But essentially what we find out, again, I'm jumping ahead, decades here. I did read this to refresh my memory because I knew they dealt with this specifically. And essentially what we find out is that the Toyman who killed Adam Grant, the Toyman with the buzzed head and the glasses and the cloak, right, who was hearing the voice of Mother, was not actually the real Toyman, but was rather an android created, a very lifelike one, created by the real Toyman. And in fact, even Hiro Nakamura, right, the young Toyman, right, who was creating all of these devices for Batman and Superman, he too was a creation of the real Toyman. I know you're a fan of Jeff Johns. I'm not a fan of Jeff Johns. In fact, I've been a big fan of him, over the years. But I feel like this is Jeff Johns at his Jeff Johnsiest because he pulled the same thing with Brainiac. Yes. It was the same deal with Brainiac. Yes. It's like, all the other Brainiacs you've seen along the way, not the real Brainiac, no. Probes. They're probes. Here, all the other Toymen you've seen, no, they're androids. No. And look, I so appreciate what he did with Hawkman back in the JSA days. Same thing there too. He was like, hey, all these Hawkmen, just reincarnation. So I feel like he's gone back to the well. The question I have is, with respect to Toyman in particular, was that the right call? Because it's so tough to read that Adam Grant story. It's not, it's hard to sit here and be like, oh, that was a really enjoyable story. Like, no, it's hard. It's very hard to read, but I don't know that I like the retcon that John's introduced. I mean, what do you think?
I'm fine with it. I mean, it's because it's comics, and that somewhere along the way someone's going to retcon that version, and they may go back to an even darker version, in some way, shape, or form. I think by retconning it like that, and it's a way to bring a character back without turning people off, because I'm sure at somewhere along the way there was someone in the office that said, look, we need to change this character, that he's not so much of a dirtbag. He's a bad guy, obviously, but we can't have him be a child killer. Make a big dopey teddy bear that lets off gas or something, but he can't kill kids. So I'm fine with it. Probably the younger version of Joe probably would have a problem with it, only because now I could see things a little bit through different eyes about it. Just knowing how the business works. But yeah, no, I'm okay with that. As long as it makes sense, as long as it's, look, there has to be a little bit of a suspension of disbelief when it comes to these characters. Like, as long as it makes sense for the story and I can get behind it, I'm cool.
And I don't mean to keep dumping on Johns, but it's just kind of funny where, and I've talked about this before, that he's never met a comic book parent that he didn't want to kill, right? Like, every time he takes over a character, he introduces, adds that to the history. And then we see this sort of fix that he employs in numerous instances. It's just interesting. When you kind of take that longer look at the creator's work. But in any event, there is an issue of Superman by Jurgens that we'll be discussing in our next episode. I think it's the next one, or maybe the one after that, where it sort of gives a little bit of a chronology of how Toyman got to this point, where essentially he was approached while he was in prison, if I'm remembering correctly, to have toys made based on his likeness. And he eventually escaped, and he went to the toy store, and he found that all of his toys hadn't sold, and they were there on clearance. And it just like set him off. And that's when he started hearing the voice of Mother, and he started blaming the children. And that's what set him down this darker path. So I guess I say that to say that I feel like the retcon like undermines the work that was done, but at the same time, I get it. I do totally get it. But in any event, this was definitely one of the key, key stories of what we read here. And
the aspect of the character I didn't particularly like was the whole big, or basically big baby, big kid aspect where he's in an oversized crib.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that part of it is a little, it's kind of dirty. you know what I mean? It's there. That's some creepiness to it. Like I probably, it wouldn't have, the fact that I get it, he's killing a child, but if he had just like a regular lair, like a dark room, but he didn't necessarily need to be in an oversized crib and talking to mommy and yeah, that part of it was a little bit, that was a little skeevy.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's really tough. Not too long ago, we covered the Brian Azzarello, Lee Bermejo miniseries Man of Steel, and that firmly positions him as a pedophile. So, where I think we're in that territory here, although they're not explicit with anything, but it's definitely, it's tough. It's very tough and a very, very dark story. I think overall, again, in terms of what we get in terms of Superman, I think there's some valuable material there. I think ultimately it did more of a disservice to Kat, and I wish that, we had followed her more through this. If you're going to put her through this, at least let it be for something. But
yeah.
In any event, let's take a quick commercial break. There's so much more to unpack about this stretch of the Triangle era, so we'll do that right after this commercial break. We'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere, via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, which happens to be my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Aw yeah. And we're back. Okay, so I know we talked about the Toyman story. Right before that, real quick, we did have a few issues that were sort of tidying up some Reign of the Supermen business, and in particular, the Reign of the Supermen characters, the remaining replacements, Steel, Superboy, and Eradicator. And essentially, these issues were more or less sending them off on their spin-off adventures, which they would have. So, there was an issue of Man of Steel where John Henry Irons talked about going to DC, and of course he would get his own DC set, Washington DC.
Yeah.
Washington DC set, Steel series. We had an issue with Superboy where Westfield, the director of Cadmus, sends these, monsters after Superboy because he's talked about Cadmus in the news. He would go off to have his Hawaii set Superboy series. And Eradicator, seemingly he perished in Reign of the Supermen, but in fact he had lived, though he was brain dead. And there's this Dr. David Connor or Connors, I forget. Connor?
I think it's Connor.
All right, we'll go with that.
Because it was Kurt Connors that was in Spider-Man.
Yes.
So, yeah.
All right, we'll go with that. So we have David Connor who's dying of cancer, and he's researching or studying Eradicator, and there's this power surge, and he ends up fusing with Eradicator. So now you have the body and powers of Eradicator and the mind of David Connor, and so those three characters are kind of like set off on their own adventure, and we would see Steel would come back during the Worlds Collide crossover, and Superboy would continue to pop up here and there as well. I guess generally speaking, did you read the Steel and Superboy series? Did you read The Outsiders, which featured Eradicator? Were you into that stuff?
I didn't read Outsiders. I read Superboy and Steel. I really enjoyed Superboy as a character. Not so much during those Hawaii storylines. The fact that King Shark was introduced is kind of cool, but I love Superboy as a character because I have been able to see his evolution over the years. Because we've seen him go from, the clone of Superman to, doing his own thing, the Superboy and the Ravers, which was just terrible. But I have every issue. And then, he was in Young Justice and then Teen Titans and all that. And, he went away and came back. So I really love his character and being able to see him evolve. And that was one of the things that I told Dan DiDio about when we talked to him, that I was really bummed that when New 52 happened, Superboy went away. Because I think that whole crew, and I don't mean to get off topic here, but that whole group of Young Justice Teen Titans really hit its stride right before New 52 happened. Those characters were compelling. They were growing both physically and, story-wise. They were just getting better, deeper. They were changing, their outfits, little things here and there. And you don't see that in comics. For the most part, you really don't see that. For the most part, Batman's Batman. He's going to be his age. He may get a little angrier or darker. The same, let's say, for, Superman's the same. Most of the characters that we know and love are kind of in their era, with the exception of the Teen Titans and the Young Justice people. They were sidekicks. They grew up into adult superheroes, and then they ushered in a new group of sidekicks and adult superheroes. So that's why I appreciate those. But to get back to your question, I'm sorry. And Steel I really liked too, and I was bummed when they started changing his costume, and he didn't have the traditional Superman S. He had more of a blocky S, and then it went away, and then it came back. So and then Shaq made a movie.
Yeah, baby. Shaq. No, I don't. I hear what you're saying, and I was a big fan of that Young Justice era. So yeah, I was really bummed. Certainly in the New 52 era, for sure. So I'm with you on that. I've read. It's funny. I've read very little, actually, believe it or not, of the Steel and Superboy series. I've read none of the Outsider series that featured Eradicator. Steel and Superboy we will be covering down the line. Superboy not too far from now. Steel will probably be a little bit later. I don't know that I'll ever really dive into that Outsiders series. And I know there was also a 3-part Eradicator miniseries. Did you ever read that back in the day?
I have, I think the first issue, but I never, for whatever reason, just never got or read the rest.
I put a call out on Twitter recently, and that was kind of the feedback that I got was like, it's okay. You might, it might be okay to skip. I with respect to Eradicator, how do I put this? I think that character would have been better served, at least for the time being, by having actually made the sacrifice of his life to bring back Kal-El in Engine City. I think this whole thing of like, oh no, he actually survived, but he's brain dead, and then he merges. You know, we've seen the Eradicator take on numerous forms, right? From the initial device that he was to the humanoid Krypton man to the quote unquote Superman of Reign of the Supermen. So we know, you know, he can survive and evolve and come back in different forms. And I think maybe if they had really given him a break and really made it that he sacrificed himself in Reign of the Supermen, that would have been my preference. And the whole idea of merging, it's really interesting. One of the other things that we'll get to later in the podcast series is the Peter David Supergirl series, where Matrix merges with a dying Linda Danvers, right? And becomes this Earthborn angel, that whole business for people who remember. But it's interesting to me. That was kind of what I had in my head when I was reading this. Like, it's interesting to see with both Supergirl and Eradicator was this idea of taking these initially artificial life forms, right, and fusing them with humans.
Yeah.
In the case of Eradicator, though, I think the David Connor business like really undermines the core concept of what the Eradicator is. This cold artificial form that is designed only to preserve Krypton and the Kryptonian way. In fairness, like I said, I've not read that miniseries. I've not read that Outsider series. So, you know, if there are any fans out there, like, let me know. I don't know. Maybe there's something that like I'm discounting.
I agree with you. I think he's one of those characters that you should only kind of break out once in a while. You know, Superboy and Steel, they are full-on heroes, and you want them to go on to have successful, heroic careers. Characters like, you know, Joker, you know, now Joker That Laughs, or Batman That Laughs, or whatever the hell his name is. You know, like, they're extreme. Like, you know, you should only break those out when, you know, when it's a big deal. I think Eradicator is one of them, and Cyborg Superman he became one of those, you know, like, you didn't hear from him for a long time. And then he made an appearance. He came back, you know, and they brought him back for, you know, Sinestro Corp War and that whole thing. And like, all right, that made sense. There's a compelling story there. You know, the same thing for Eradicator. If he's going to give his life, you need to make that matter. So you can't just have a guy give his life for the ultimate superhero, and then, you know, a few issues down the road, now he's just this guy, you know, he's another superhero in the shuffle. It makes his sacrifice somewhat meaningless, or less meaningful, I should say.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And, you know, one of the other questions that our patron Brian had raised, and we might come back to this in other episodes, but he asked, you know, were there any characters who, you know, we wish had stuck around, or alternatively characters who were introduced who we wish hadn't been? And I will say that I can totally appreciate it. I know at the time, I remember the advertising campaign was Reign of Tomorrow, right? And there was the Supergirl miniseries, which was not officially homework for this. I did read that, though, as Roger Stern wrote it, and it tied in with Lex II's deterioration due to this clone plague, right? Leading into the battle for Metropolis and the fall of Metropolis. But so there was a Supergirl 4-part miniseries, there was the new Steel ongoing, and the Superboy ongoing. And the three of those together were under this banner, Reign of Tomorrow. And again, Eradicator would very shortly pop up as a you know, a regular cast member in Outsider. So, like, I know they had other plans for these characters and they had other places for them. But that's one of the things that I wish maybe could have played out in the pages of these issues that we read, you know, to see more interaction between Clark and John Henry, or Clark and Superboy at that point in time. Yeah. So to Brian's question, yeah, that's one of the things, you know, they have those initial issues, but then like they're kind of off. So I wish that we had been able to have more with them at that point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. They were created as a result of a major Superman story arc, and they should be a little bit more integral and, you know, a little bit more than what they were. Yeah.
But in any event, you do get those issues. You know, the other thing that I do wonder, going back to what you were saying before about kind of our overall impressions of this period of the Triangle era. I mean, I have to imagine that after Death and Funeral and Reign, there had to be some level of burnout. And I know you did have someone new like Barry Kitson coming on, but I wonder, that's one of the things that I was thinking of as I was reading this. I wonder if there was a little bit of that going on, and maybe that might account for why I didn't feel it was quite up to the level that I felt it achieved in the earlier part of the Triangle era. I just wonder, because I was what I'm sure was a very hectic time, and there were a lot of eyes on them and a lot of attention, and these were big stories that they were telling for an extended period of time. So, I wonder if that was kind of at play as they were heading into this post-Reign period.
I think reading it in a large chunk that we've had to do for this, you see a bit of that burnout, because you're out of the gate, or at least as it pertains to the section we're reading here, out of the gate you have some very heavy storylines, and like I said, it that line goes up and down because you have some weak content along the way. And I think, look, the writers, they were creating a weekly, call it whatever the title is, action, Man of Steel, adventure. It's a Superman comic. It became a weekly series. So they have to basically, they're writing their own stories for those issues, but I'm sure they were, they're going back to the overall, the editors, and like, this is what we have, and they have to fall in line with that. So, there's going to be some fatigue after a while, and I'm sure, I'll put it this way: there's a reason why there's not that many Superman titles now, because after a while they came to realize, like, dude, we're going to kill ourselves, if we keep this up. So, and from a fan point of view, you're going to get a little burned out on Superman. Like, there's another one each week. I got to read all this. And granted, they're, each issue concentrated on a different aspect of what was going on, but still, after a while, like, you need a little bit of a super breather.
I think that's it. I think for both the creators and the audience, I think that's going on there. And one of the things I was reflecting on is that I feel like one of the criticisms that's been levied against this era, and it's one that I've sort of parroted over the years, and now I'm evaluating it for myself, reading it through adult eyes, is that after the success of the death of Superman, that the creators of the Triangle era were always sort of chasing something along those lines. That you had these the intention, right, was creating events in similar scope and scale. And I guess going into this reading assignment, I was hoping that wouldn't necessarily be the case, that I would feel like, no, that wasn't really what they're doing. But, so much of what we read here was dominated by the destruction of Metropolis. Mm-hmm. And there were so many, I don't know if you were clocking this, but there were so many instances where I think about when Superman was fighting Massacre, for example, where characters would be like, oh, haven't seen him go up against someone like that since Doomsday. Or, he hasn't seemed so determined or so relentless. Speaking about Superman, He hasn't seemed so relentless since he went up against Doomsday. It's always calling that to mind. Now, here, I'll play both sides, because I'm like, all right, on the one hand, it's like, all right, like beating us over the head with this and really trying to, I guess, conjure some of that Death of Superman magic. But on the other hand, in fairness, this was such a monumental, traumatic event in all of their lives. So it is actually reasonable that they would be thinking about that. Like when Superman goes into battle with Massacre, who, in appearance and motives is not dissimilar from Doomsday. So I'll back off on that, because I feel like that does track.
I agree with you. I think that's the thing about comics, at least with these comics. They're repetitive, like we've mentioned. And, I think maybe that's done purposefully, because you may have people who are, jumping in at a particular time. So they're throwing in these little, these lines and, this dialogue, so people can kind of, keep that in the back of their head. But at the same time, the time frame in which all this happens in comic book world is not equivalent to the way it's happening in the real world. We have the death of Superman, And all the occurrences thereafter, up until the area that we're covering. I don't know, what is that? 2 years, a year, whatever it is. It's certainly a compressed time. That's why, like, if we were to live, let's just say, and I'm as a comic book reader, I always read this. Okay, let's say you're a superhero, right? So every goddamn day you're fighting there is something going on. How does Clark Kent write I mean, God knows, I know he could type super fast, but come on. Every day he's fighting something. Every day he's saving a person. And there's some major event happening that's resetting his life. What? Like, after a while, you can't be upset that Metropolis was destroyed yet again. When did they have the time to rebuild it from the last major event? So, it's when you start thinking of things logically like that, it puts things into perspective. So yeah, they're going to keep mentioning Doomsday because, it literally just happened,
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I know the last batch of stories that we read were the issues that tied into the 0 hour event. And what's so funny there is that, and I do appreciate this, that the regular Superman creative teams had Clark checking in at the Daily Planet. And just as I was reading it, it's like,
yeah.
What is this guy doing this?
Yeah, just to make you, just to remind you, he's got a job. He's got a,
Yeah. So one of the things that, like I said, and I guess this kind of ties back to what I was saying with Cat Grant. Again, a few threads that I wished had been continued. One of them is very minor, but I liked it, and I felt like it was done away with so quickly. Clark rooming with Jimmy Olsen, right? So Clark comes back from the dead as well, right? As we dealt with, at the end of Reign of the Supermen, and his Superboy's actually living in his apartment at this point in time, and so much of Metropolis has been demolished. It's hard to find a place where. It's still the 90s. I guess it would have been too progressive for the engaged Lois and Clark to move in together. That's not even, They don't even bring that up. It's not even mentioned. But so he ends up living with Jimmy. And, it's a little bit of a new shade of Clark. He's got a new lease on life. He's back. They're like blasting music. It's a little bit of a different side of that, but it just kind of goes nowhere. But it was.
Yeah. And Jimmy still doesn't know that he's Superman.
Yeah. But again, that's one of those things. Do I expect that this would be a major part of the stories, the two of them living together? No, but I just think it was like a cool little bit that there just wasn't room for. Yeah. In these big stories.
They throw it in there to remind you, like, yeah, he's got a normal life aside from all this. And when he's not fighting crime, this is where he's sleeping. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, I don't have a ton to say necessarily about that spilled blood arc. I don't know if you wanted to spend time on that before we get to the, Superman's overcharged
spilled
powers.
Blood dealing with that was Bloodsport and Bloodthirst.
Yeah.
So the only thing I really wanted to say about that is I appreciated the realness of that story, in that you have someone who is, and I only say that because it was kind of echoed or very similar in the Peacemaker series. You had a white supremacist who has somewhat like some weirdo superpowers, and he's going around killing minorities and other non-Caucasian people. Other than that, it bookended this whole arc quite literally, because right out of the gate it's right after Toyman it's Bloodsport, and then right at the very end before we jump into 0 hour, Bloodsport, or no, right after again, I guess I lost track, but anyway, Bloodsport shows up again. So it was a pretty it was I appreciate those stories that are, as they say, ripped from the headlines. So,
yeah, I think the Bloods, it's interesting. And again, going back to what we were saying about where these stories are placed, it was real. I mean, it was tough going from the slaughter of a child to this white supremacist supervillain. Like it was just like, that's what I'm saying. It just felt like a little bit much. Like on the one hand, it felt On the one hand, it felt a little jarring to not be following Kat as directly as you might like coming out of her story. But then on top of that, it's like just going from one very dark, very ugly plot line to another. It was just a little bit much. The blood sport aspect of it, I do think is interesting to your point. And I think, it gives, Ron Troop, the black reporter at the Daily Planet, gets a lot of play in that. And in Bloodsport's return later on. And Ron Troop in that later issue, he saves the day, right? He's the one who realizes, right, that Bloodsport is, he's, transporting weapons in from some place. And Ron tracks down where this place is and he blows it up. And the next time Bloodsport tries to call in one of his weapons, it's just scrap. Like, it was great.
Yeah.
That was great. The whole high tech character who's also involved with this, and then Bloodthirst, who's really pulling the strings and is trying to sow the seeds of conflict throughout society. It lost me, man. I was not having that.
I agree with you. It went in too many directions. And the artwork on that Bloodthirst character just pissed me off. I just, there's no other way to say it. I can't sugarcoat it. It angered me because she looked like something out of like Mad Magazine. And I'm like, I get this is your style, man, but you gotta use your eraser a little bit more.
Yeah, it was rough. I mean, I don't know if for anyone, and I'm sure there are people listening who are like, who the hell is Bloodsport? Like Bloodthirst? Who are they talking about? I mean, I'm looking at it right now on my iPad. It's like, I don't know. It's a cross between like Bane and I don't know what.
It's I don't know, man. So it's this. The cover is just this bondage-looking woman, holding the get to the thing, just the tattered cape, and she's got this weirdo, face on. So it's kind of reminiscent of something from like the Batman the Animated Series, or the Justice League Unlimited series, something kind of off the wall like that, and she's like, super China jacked, but it didn't like, first of all, why is one is blood sport, the other was Bloodthirst? You couldn't think of any other name. Like, there's too much similarity between those names, first of all. And, like you said, she's got like green mist coming out of her, I don't know, these holes in her body. It's like very reminiscent of Bane. So I don't know. It didn't like it. I lost me in there. I'll be honest with you. I just skimmed through that because I was like, this pisses me off.
I mean, I remember not liking this as a kid. I remember that. And that held true here. As I'm, kind of scrolling through this iPad screen on the DC app, they do, credit where credit's due. I dump on the DC app a lot, but they do have the triangle era organized very nicely. Kudos to whoever set that up.
Oh, good.
So we do have that there. But, as I'm looking through this, on the one hand, I feel there's a lot of momentum in these issues, but I think that works against my enjoyment in certain instances because I feel like it would be nice to sort of settle back in here. And I don't mean to belabor the point, but spending some more time with the supporting cast and seeing Clark reacclimate to being back. Again, we do have, like I said before, when he and Lois are away and he talks about deserving a break and moving in with Jimmy and exploring his, musical, tastes. But I don't like, there's not enough of that. And in fairness, I don't know that, these comics in the 90s were necessarily, that this wasn't necessarily the mandate, but I don't know, like it would have been cool. The death was such a momentous event in the character's journey. And it would have been cool to see that unpacked and explored a little bit more. And I felt like these stories just like kept barreling forward. And on the one hand, it's like, okay, like it, keeps it cool. It keeps it exciting for the reader. But I think that worked against it for me in a lot of these things. Cause it's just like, again, as I'm scrolling through here, it's like next we're off, Superman's in space for a few issues. We come back for the Bizarro arc. We get into, and then we're like right into the Fall of Metropolis. Like it's just one thing after the next. It doesn't let up at all.
Yeah, I appreciate those episodes. I keep talking like it's a...
I do that. I do that all the time.
I appreciate those issues that kind of rein things back in. And I think the same holds true really for TV shows too, because there you have your penultimate episode. You have these big arcs. You have big events that happen. Well, the next event that happens is only going to be good if you take a beat, gather your thoughts, catch your breath, and kind of regroup. And I say this from as someone who just reads current comics. It's one event after another. And we went in the past few years, we've gone through a bunch of crises, of major events happening. And they're only going to be good if you have the time to kind of, like you said, unpack it. You need to kind of explore what happened and see how the last event affected the world that you're in. And to jump from one to the other, like after a while, it's, first of all, the seriousness or the gravitas of each event is not going to be measurable if you don't have something that's, if you don't have any downtime in between. So
that's the thing. And I feel like that's what the earlier segment of the Triangle era did better. Unless I'm just remembering it that way, but I really feel like there were more moments and stories like that. So, as we make our way through here, we get into this business that I was talking about before of Superman's powers expanding. And like I said, I mean, it's issue after issue. There's some instance where he experiences some sort of power surge, right? And, it's not until after the Bizarro arc, which, we will talk about, but where things really come to a head and his body enlarges. And it's funny when we talk about, like, it's called Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. One part of my Superman fan journey that I think I've largely forgotten, and I don't think I've really talked about. I came in, as everyone knows, with Death of Superman, but there were a couple of points along the way in the Triangle era where I kind of like fell off, but I like relatively quickly got back on and caught up. So it wasn't like, oh man, I was out of it for years. It was like, no, like I kind of took a step back, but then I caught up in back issues. And I think, so I don't know, Man of Steel 33, Superman 89, those are the issues where Superman is at his largest, physically, literally. And I feel like those were maybe my like last issues for a little while. And then I went back. Like I hated, and even upon reread, did not care for this. What was your take on this whole run?
It's so reading this initial, his powers get all weird. It's a reoccurring theme with Superman, like his powers go haywire for a while and he's got to find a way to overcome that. And sometimes he becomes a blue electricity guy. And other times he's swinging from, the buildings with a grappling hook. So like I don't like the grotesque, huge Superman either. He looks like a Neanderthal, but I guess that's kind of, he's grown to monstrous proportions and that's the look they're going for. It was okay. It didn't bother me so much. I got a little bit more annoyed in the fact that he's just getting entangled in other, outer space, political issues or, intertwined in other people's business. That bothered me a little bit more. I'm like, just mind your own damn business. Like your powers are going haywire. Just go fix yourself.
Okay. So that's a perfect segue. First, though, let me say, so yes, he does have this whole run of issues where he's like lost in space and he's able to breathe. He doesn't need to breathe for this extremely extended period of time, which is different for him. Shout out to our one of our guests on the show, Justin DeVoe, who cosplays as Lobo. I thought of him, of course, as I was reading those Lobo issues. But so what you just brought up speaks to, I think, the biggest problem that I had with this power surge, or whatever you want to call it, is that it takes him so long to seek help. It actually annoyed me. And especially since we're getting all of this repetition, all of these instances where he knows something's a little amiss. And yes, he's plenty busy and he's being pulled in a lot of directions. But there's one of the issues where he finally goes to help. The precipitating event for that is, I think that's when he returns to Earth, like he crashes through a building or something like that. And Maggie Sawyer with the SCU shows up and he he's ready to turn himself in, right? To the SCU. And Maggie, like, it was a very clever scene, and I like the way it was played where she's like, oh, like, basically saying like, oh, I'm sure, it was some villain who did this or whatever. Someone who did this, like whoever did this probably should go get checked out, right? They don't need to be locked up, wasting time.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, buddy, like, it's like she's giving you a hint here. And I love that moment for Maggie, but I'm thinking to myself, it's like, why have you needed this nudging? Like you should have, I don't know. It just kind of annoyed me. I felt like it was so drawn out before he finally goes to Hamilton for help. Now, one thing I liked about this, Hamilton's theory is that when all that kryptonite energy in Engine City passed through the Eradicator into Superman, that irradiated form of energy is what's causing him to absorb too much solar radiation and for his powers to go amok and for him to enlarge like this. So I guess I like that callback. I don't know. Was it a good payoff to the Engine City? I don't know. Part of me is like, well, I could have done without this altogether. But if we're gonna have it, at least it tied into something.
I don't think they need to keep going back to the events of Death of Superman and have these lingering things. Death of Superman and all the subsequent events around that series just need to remain in there. I mean, the fact that you have Superboy and Steel, fine, and all these other characters that came out of it, but the lasting effects, I think, again, it comes back kind of like to the Eradicator stuff I said, like the fact that, okay, he got the powers back as a result of him sacrificing himself at that convoluted, kind of event. Fine. Okay, cool. But he got the powers back, right? And he kicked ass in that last, end of the issue. So, okay, so cool. And the end of that issue is him flying like big ass, badass Superman, straight at the reader. He's like, I'm back. Okay, so then you jump forward to now, and now your powers are all screwy as a result. So doing stuff like this, I think, lessens the impact of those events. It doesn't make it and maybe I'm just being a crotchety person now, but like it just seems like move on. You can look, it's comics. You can make the power issues be anything else. As a result of all the stuff that Lex Luthor is doing to, clone his body, somehow there's some side effect that affected Superman. Like tie it into something that's currently going on, not to this event that happened, in comics at that point, 2 years ago. So I don't know.
No, I think I'm with you, man. I think it does more harm than good, and it does undermine what had come before. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, there's part of me that sort of likes that it ties back in, but yeah, on the other hand, it's like just kind of leave it be. And yeah, I don't know. Like I think back to the end of Reign of the Super. I think it was one of those. I forget the issue number, but an issue of Adventures of Superman where he's flying through the sky at the end, and he's like, "I'm back. Like I feel better than ever." And it's like, well, now you go back and look at that. It's like, well, you feel better than ever because you're like supercharged. And this is going to go very badly for you. For anyone who really is not familiar with these issues, I mean, it's. I think you use the word grotesque. It's like Superman enlarges to the point of the Hulk, for example, right? Like he's just this lumbering mass. Like he can't sit down on a chair. He can't touch anything. I think I don't know if there had been more time to explore that. I don't know, that aspect that his powers were so working against him that he couldn't help people. I don't know. I think it's also the visual. There's just something about it that from when I was a little kid, I always just felt so put off by it.
It was definitely off-putting. I agree with you 100%. I looked at it, and he has to, in one moment, he has to wrap metal from a ship that had blown up around his head so he didn't just blast people with his his heat vision and stuff like that. And he just the cover really did it. I mean, I hate looking at it, but like it kind of encapsulated the events of the issue pretty well, in that, you know, he looks like a lumbering Neanderthal, like just veiny, like he is just on something. You know, it made the, I'll tell you one thing, the cover, it made you think that the issue was a lot darker than it was going to be.
Yes.
You know, like I thought there was going to be some major stuff going on, and it just wasn't that. But yeah, but yeah, I was glad I got through this.
Yes.
Moving on.
So yeah, and eventually, so Parasite is able to drain away that excess energy, and Superman gets a clean bill of health. But so I'm gonna back up a little bit here to go to this Bizarro's World arc, but this ties in with really most of the rest of what we're talking about, which is this clone plague that is afflicting some of the clones of Cadmus, as well as the Underworlders, and of course, perhaps most notably, Lex Luthor II. The son of Lex Luthor, who is actually the original Lex Luthor in a cloned body, posing as his own Australian son. I always have to remind myself to hear Lex II's dialogue in that Australian accent. It just adds to it.
It wasn't until you just said it that I was like, oh yeah. I totally didn't remember that, and until you said it, I'm like, oh yeah, sure, because of course he's Australian.
But doesn't that color everything differently?
But he looks like the biggest Scotsman in the world. I mean,
yeah. Well, we talked about this last year because, you know, all of this business about him being Australian came before the death of Superman, and so when I started, I mean, I don't know that there were necessarily many, if any, references in the death and reign and the stories that we read now. Like most of it came before. So when I was reading these stories as a kid, like I didn't even dawn on me. So now going back, it's like, oh yeah, like he's Australian allegedly.
Because naturally.
So again, like I said, I mean, this really carries us through probably the bulk of what we read. I know we're past the hour mark here, but you know, the bulk of
it's all good
of what we read here. This plague that is afflicting the clones of Metropolis that will lead to this conflict between LexCorp and Cadmus and the Underworlders. Really, these three forces coming together, and you know, that wreaks enough havoc on the city, but it's ultimately Lex's plans and then later his fail-safes that result in the utter destruction of Metropolis. First in the battle for Metropolis and then the fall of Metropolis. So for this leg of the reading, I mean, I guess, like I said, big picture, what's your, what was your take on this?
Well, I like Bizarro, the character of Bizarro. I really enjoy it. And, you know, I know there's been numerous iterations of Bizarro over the years. I like this one. However, I really fell in love with the Ed McGuinness version of Bizarro. You know, the whole talking in opposites gets a bit wonky after a while. But the Ed McGuinness version of Bizarro really, I really adored that one. And then the most recent versions of Bizarro kind of had been really cool in current comics, and I don't know if he's in anything now. I think he died somehow, giving his life to help somebody. You know, he was very hipsterish. He had a mohawk and a goatee and all that sort of thing. But as pertains to the rest of the story, I was rushing to get through it so I can hit the 0 hour stuff, because it seemed like, okay, I understand there's a lot going on. There are these warring factions, but it seems like this is something Superman could have really taken care of much easier than lasting as much as it did. You know, call in someone else if you need a hand, but like these goofball Underworlders were the ones that, when Death of Superman was kicking off, they were the goofballs at the beginning of that series. And they were quite literally comic relief in those issues, especially the guy with the spikes in his head. And, you know, he was like he ate a grenade or something stupid like that. And if he's going to be comic relief, to have him back as more of a, you can't believe him as to be a challenge in any way. So it just seemed like this was filler for 0 hour until they got to the 0 hour issues.
Gotcha. Okay. So I think that kind of lines up with my overall impressions of a lot of this as well. So I guess as far as the different factions, and I guess just to give some context for people. So again, clones are dying. The Underworlders, who were these failed cloned experiments of Project Cadmus, blame Cadmus in large part because they go to Professor Emil Hamilton for help. And he surmises that when Cadmus flooded the tunnels underneath Metropolis, this was when they were stealing Superman's body back during a funeral for a friend, something in the water caused them to get sick, right? So they have their sights set on Cadmus. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor, right, because Lex II, he is suffering from this as well, and he was involved in that business in the tunnels as well. And he proposes an alliance/merger with Paul Westfield, the director of Cadmus, who rebuffs him. And then, so that sets Lex off, right? And he goes on the news and he's condemning Cadmus and he's staging this attack on Cadmus. And then it just sort of snowballs from there. So again, you have the Underworlders, you have Cadmus, you have LexCorp. And, it's all building. One of my favorite Batman stories is No Man's Land.
Yeah.
And it's what got me into reading Batman. The earthquake, to me, is the least interesting part of that storyline.
Yeah.
Where that gets going, where that really gets cooking, is when you see these different factions within Gotham carving up the territory, some on the side of good, some not, and fighting to hold on, and Batman having this crisis of faith and abandoning Gotham and coming back. Like, there's some really good stuff there. And maybe this is unfair to put on the Superman creators of the time because, it's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight and seeing a story like No Man's Land. But as I'm reading this, so much of the story is building towards the destruction. But I feel like the more interesting part is, well, okay, what comes after? And in this case, nothing comes after because very shortly after Metropolis is reduced to rubble, we have 0 Hour. And in the next episode, we'll talk about the 0 month issues where all of the books had a 0 issue. And, Metropolis is restored by that point. And later on, there will be an issue where we see exactly how that happened. Magic was involved. They used Perry White's memory of Metropolis to bring it back. It's this whole thing. But I guess I just feel like I have to imagine when they were having their super summit, there's this idea, and I don't know, but I have to imagine that there was some instance of we can destroy the city because we have this very convenient reset point coming up.
Right.
And I just feel like it just goes back to the Cat Grant thing. It's like, all right, if you're going to murder this poor woman's son, it's like, see this through and use it for something with her character. Same thing here is like, all right, if you're going to destroy the city, take the time to really tell that storyline. And yes, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that something like Batman No Man's Land could be a really rich story, really rich territory to explore. But here, so much of it is just about the actual destruction of it.
Right.
And this I found wore on me as well because, all this clone business is really building for a lot of issues. And then Battle for Metropolis is a good 4 issues. The Fall of Metropolis is another 5 issues. The Worlds Collide and the Massacre issues and Bloodsport, that's all dealing with that immediate aftermath. Like, it's a lot.
It is a lot. And and again, this is a comic book, trope, but why is Metropolis getting destroyed so much of a problem now when it wasn't in the past? Or why is it more important now? Let me put it that way. Because during Death of Superman, the city was just destroyed. Of course, it's been destroyed over the years, like any other major event or any other battle with superheroes. So it's again, you have to make these things matter. And I don't think they pulled off the reason for it mattering. In other words, I think it was, these two or these factions that are somewhat, one of which very low level, quite literally and figuratively, and going up against, LexCorp and all that sort of thing, this really shouldn't have, it just seems like it shouldn't have happened. Superman could have squashed this. He could have done a better job. And the thing that really course, they made it the most dramatic is when the Daily Planet globe falls. That's the big thing. The other buildings falling, terrible. But when that globe falls, that's the big, F you.
And I will say, though, what worked about that for me was seeing it through the eyes of Perry White. And I think that's where I've said this a lot on the show, especially when we talk about the big events and crossovers, where for me, having a point of view character goes a long way. Mm-hmm. And I feel like had this story been told through the eyes of Perry White, beyond just that moment of the globe's destruction, I don't know. It might have had a little more resonance, but you didn't have that. Our patron Brian also asked when Perry White starts saying "Great Shades of Elvis," because that was, of course, a big part of the character on Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, and so I don't know if it was like the very first, but I know that in one of those 0 Hour crossover issues where Perry White is being erased from the timeline, as he fades away, he does say "Great Shades of Elvis." So
everything is it all comes back to Lois and Clark.
It all comes back to Lois and Clark. But so in any event, this I agree with you, and maybe this is becoming a bit of a theme here. Superman shouldn't have taken that vacation with Lois. Superman should have gotten himself checked out a lot sooner. Superman probably could have squashed this conflict before it escalated.
I think I've criticized more of Superman than I did praise, but I love Superman. I genuinely love the character, but I think and I think I told this to you once before, offline, is that I think that the things that make Superman great are also the things that make Superman the hardest to write for as a character, because you've created a godlike character. So how do you challenge this person? And if every time you challenge them, they need to become better as a result of that conflict. So, the only way you can really challenge a character like Superman is, okay, well, we know he's a weakness to magic. All right, so how many times are you going to pull that out of the bag? You have to take away his powers, or at least weaken him in some way so he's on par with some other, being, Doomsday, So it's hard. Like, you have these battles. Like, dude, Superman is great. Everything he stands for is just, I think, at what most people want to stand for. And he has all the cool powers. When you ask people, like, what superpower do you want? No, I want to fly. I want to, be super strong and do all these sort of things. But to write compelling stories and come up with great storylines that really capture our imagination on a weekly or monthly basis, holy cow, I would not want that. I don't want that job. So I think, as pertains to the writers and creators coming up with this stuff, when they hit their stride, they do it right. But I think they fall into these ruts more often than not.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing that bear out here, and I think, like, again, I really think that the bones of a really good story are here. I think the idea of Metropolis, being destroyed. I mean, of course, there's a lot to explore there, but again, I think we stop short of really getting into the interesting territory. And to your point, and I was thinking about this too. It's like Metropolis was basically destroyed in the battle with Doomsday. Yeah. I mean, I know this is taking it to another level. I can appreciate that, but I feel like there maybe more could have been done in the aftermath of Reign of the Superman, as Superman is returning to Metropolis and seeing the destruction that the city is still contending with, and maybe getting into some of those issues there. As I say all of this, again, I recognize that what I am looking for out of these comics as an adult in 2022 is not necessarily what the objective was for these creators in 1993 and 1994. I totally get that.
Yeah.
At the same time, I still feel the way I feel, and it just kind of like breaks my heart where you see these moments where it's like, oh God, like we were so close. Like we were really close to something that could have been, that maybe could have stood the test of time a little bit more. Because what's funny is this is a separate thing, and I've ranted about this before, but the lack of availability of a lot of these, Triangle era stories. And again, the app, in fairness, does a really good job, but there were a number of stories that were collected in trade paperbacks that are now out of print, right? But I know they did a trade of the death of Clark Kent. They did a trade of the trial of Superman, which we'll get to in upcoming episodes. To my knowledge, there was never a trade collecting the battle for Metropolis and the fall of Metropolis. I feel like this is one of those stories, not that you hear Trial of Superman referenced all that much, but, I feel like this is somewhat of a forgotten period.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I think stories like this would benefit from their own title. And I say that because you have 4 Superman, at the time, you had 4 Superman titles. Okay. You could have used one of those as the issue or series that you fleshed out these storylines and characters. It could still be a Superman title. Superman doesn't have to be in it. Like the whole thing with Cat Grant, Superman really has no involvement in that whatsoever. That's just an investigative reporter doing her job. Okay, maybe in the background you see Superman fly off, or maybe there's something over the news. But, he doesn't even have to be in it. And that you really could dive into the character and really build on those storylines.
Absolutely. No, I'm with you, man. But it is what it is. We do get Action 700, which I think is that's Roger Stern's swan song on the title. He'll come back with the Man of Tomorrow quarterly title, not too far from now, so he'll be back. But I loved his tenure on the super titles, and I did think that Action 700 was a strong one. And the bright spot for me in all of these issues was Lois's investigation into Lex II, right? Yeah. And it starts this is where I think they're at their best, to be honest. It starts very early on with some insurance fraud, right? Where there are some buildings that are still standing, right? And then there are these mysterious fires, and it seems like there's some insurance fraud going on. And, she keeps digging, right? And we get into all of this business about Sasha Green, the karate instructor, which there was also all this other business in the Superman annuals when they did the Bloodlines event. Prior to that, right, where Sasha Green, her corpse was animated and infected by this alien form, and she became part of a character called Myriad. Do you remember any of this?
You're saying Myriad. That I definitely remember that. That name. But yeah, I don't remember that too much though. There's some weird stuff, man.
Weird stuff for sure, but. I just say this in case anyone's when I mentioned Sasha Green, it's oh, she had this other, I do understand that there was a little bit more going on with the character, but Lois continues digging, right? And she doesn't buy this cover story that Sasha Green moved to Coast City. And she finds that, all of Sasha's belongings were still in her locker. Of course, that doesn't make any sense. And we know she has this mystery informant. We don't know who it is. During that Bizarro arc, right? Lex and his Dr. Happerson, the ever loyal Happerson, right? They recreate Bizarro to try to study this cloned body. Maybe there's a cure for Lex somewhere in there. And this poor, I enjoyed the Bizarro arc. I loved, to your point, I love that we did not have the Bizarro speak. That's my least favorite aspect of the character.
Yeah.
And I think that this iteration, for me, this is Bizarro, a failed cloned experiment created by Luthor, who, thinks he's Superman, and there's this element of tragedy, right? He realizes that he's not, and he sacrifices himself. That to me is a sweet spot when it comes to Bizarro. Yeah. Just like we got in the animated series. That's what works best, for my taste at least. And, towards the end of that Bizarro arc, Bizarro destroys the research that they've gathered from him. And there's one of the LexCorp soldiers on his knees, upset about this, right? And the mask comes off, and Lois sees that it's Lex II, looking very rough, right? Because he's suffering from this affliction. So she's really following this all the way through. I like that a lot. I mean, if I had my way, to your point, it's it would be great if one of these 4 titles were just about Lois's investigation. It would have been amazing. Yeah. But I love that she dug into this, and it's interesting, right? Because as the audience, we've known all along about Lex II. But our characters, our heroes, have been in the dark about this. So to finally get the light shed on that, I thought was really cool. And I appreciated Action 700 because at the end of that Bizarro arc, Lois sees Lex in the LexCorp costume, right? Upset about the destruction of the Bizarro and the research. And then like the next issue, Lois is I think it's the next issue. Lois is talking about how Lex the second is actually Lex the first. And I always thought initially, I was like, how did she piece that together? But then Action 700 gives you a little bit, like it fills in some gaps. And we see that she was approached by her informant at that point. And I think she got a little bit more of the context there. And the informant turns out to be none other than Dr. Gretchen Kelly, one of Lex's closest confidants and advisors, the alleged mother of Lex the second. So she really has a turn. But yeah, I thought the lowest part of all of this was one of the highlights for me.
I agree with you on that. My big problem with this issue is this whole Lord Satanus thing, where all of a sudden you have this made no sense. I read it and I had to stop myself and reread it because I'm like, did I miss something? Because this made no sense to me whatsoever. Like, this character is in here, why? Like, and there was no payoff to it later on. Like, there was, unless I have to read way down the line for it to come back around. But it just didn't really make any sense to me.
So here was my read on this. I think that for Action 700, because it was an anniversary milestone issue, and the fact that it was also Roger Stern's farewell, I think they were trying to pack it with as much that called back to earlier periods in the Triangle era as possible. Because you're right, reading it in the context of the battle for Metropolis and the fall of Metropolis, like it comes out of nowhere, right? Yeah. He doesn't have any other play in any of the other 42 issues that we read.
Yeah, there's no like panel where like the character in his human form is kind of overlooking and be like, yes, my plan is coming together type. Like there's none of that. It's just, okay, here's like the next page and boom, it's that. Really? Like, all right.
So I think that's why it's also why, there's, Lana and Pete are largely absent from all of the issues that we read, except 700, where we keep cutting back to their wedding at the Kent farm. Lana does get more play in that Roger Stern Supergirl miniseries. Supergirl goes to Lana for help and for, to sort of share what's been going on with her. But yeah, so I think that was more what's going on with 700. So in that sense, I get it. But yeah, in terms of the larger story, I think it is a little bit like, where is this coming from? The thing that I like most, I think, about the fall of Metropolis is Lex's growing desperation. And the fact that, he's at this point where he's like, well, if I can't live, right, and rule over Metropolis, I'm going to destroy Metropolis. And there are, again, he's engineered this conflict with Cadmus, and he has these smaller bombs planted throughout the city. Lois finds the map that shows where the bombs are placed. So she's really got the goods on Lex. But then it turns out he has these larger, more powerful missiles that really can do major damage. But what I thought was such an interesting turn, where Superman shows up on Lex's yacht, I think, and is actually able to get through to him before the missiles are launched. And basically says, like, look, you always talk about how much you love this city. Do you really want to destroy it? And Lex, for all of his evil and all of his flaws, is like, no, I don't. And then you have Happerson out of nowhere was like, you see his thought bubbles and he's like, how, Superman, like he's, confusing Lex or something like that. Like, Lex, how could you give up on this?
I've been so loyal to you all this whole time. And,
Yeah, like Happerson bought into this more than I ever thought. That was actually kind of surprising to me.
Yeah. If you boil it down, Lex really should have done more. Look, I know you're dying, man, but get off your ass. But I like Lex, and I really like when there are these peaks of humanity that shine through, and it's like reminds me of. I think it was in one of the animated series episodes, or it was maybe also been in an issue where one of the Bizarros dies, and someone's like, well, like Lex is over it, saying, like Lex is genuinely heartbroken that Bizarro is dying or dead, and people are like, well, what do you care? You just make another one or something like that. And he goes, I care because he was mine, and he has some love and affection towards this creature. It may have been in New 52. I'm thinking.
I think it was Forever Evil.
Yes. Correct. When Bizarro like sacrificed himself. But yeah, it was when you see a character like Lex, who really, before Superman came around, was the guy in Metropolis, and was then overshadowed by Superman. The fact that he has these moments of humanity, like I'm like, oh, I really like that, So
you and I are on the same page when it comes to Lex. I've been saying this on the show for a while, and we did a huge run of Lex episodes, and it's like I think this always goes back to Smallville for me, where it's like, yeah, you've got to have that bedrock of humanity and this like tragic aspect to the character. If he's just a monster, for me, like it does, I just don't get as much mileage out of that. So the fact that there was that brief moment where he's like, okay, like Superman is actually able to get through to him, I like that. And then of course Happerson goes rogue and sends these missiles off, and that's where Lord Satanus comes into play, and he like gives Superman like a mental nudge to kind of point him in the right direction of how to stop the missiles. And he makes sure that the news time building that he runs and his human guys remain standing while the LexCorp tower is destroyed.
Yeah.
But this really results in true devastation to the city, and then it continues because Lex had all of these fail safes as well. Like if Metropolis ever fell, a la Engine City, there would be all of these other robots and other countermeasures that would come to a gas that causes hallucinations, that causes you to sort of see your fears. So there's a lot of that going on in those issues subsequent to 700, where there's like failsafe after failsafe, and the destruction continues. I think though, other than that moment with Superman and Lex on the yacht, what I really did like about this, I found it very satisfying. I don't know what your take on it was, but the finale to this, Action 701. So this was Karl Kesel guest writing after Roger Stern has left. And the story is told largely in splash pages, a la Superman 75. Not entirely, but largely. Mm-hmm. And it comes down to the final failsafe is the Kryptonian battle suit that brought Kal-El from the fortress back to Metropolis after he was revived. And I thought that was a nice callback where Superman was like, oh yeah, like I kind of left that there when we went to Coast City, and Lex took it. And that's the final failsafe. And the armor, takes Lex and he's able to control it. And this whole story comes down to this battle in Metropolis, that has its climax at the Superman Memorial statue, which gets destroyed in this fight between Lex in armor versus Superman. And we've talked a lot on the show about the evolution of these characters, and in particular Lex, and how he went from Lex pre-crisis in the green battlesuit, actually out there having these adventures, being in the action, to, again, the evil businessman iteration in the boardroom. And I felt like Lex in the purple Kryptonian battlesuit was a nice callback to the pre-crisis version, and the fact that it came down to this confrontation between the two of them. But did you find that was a fitting finale?
I did, because you had the battle suit, which was this aid to Superman to help him, in his time of need, which he now has to fight. Okay. And to your point about the battles, the traditional Lex Luthor green battle suit, which then came back again later down the road. And I was so excited about that, by the way. I think it was like Infinite Crisis, when someone cracked open a crate and you just see like part of it in the crate. And I was like, ooh, that's going to happen. Anyway, I was reading this and I was like, someone pitched the suit. I could tell you, someone along the way was like, let's just bring the suit back. And someone was like, no, we can't do that, because I guess they were distancing themselves from that period for whatever reason. But only made sense. Like it totally would have made sense in some way to bring that in there. But I loved it. Superman saves his mortal enemy, and the last panel is Lex just pissed. But it was a really the artwork I really enjoyed. There are a lot of there are callbacks to the certain angles and the way the characters were drawn that I thought were callbacks to Death of Superman or Return of Superman specifically. He's just hunched over looking at camera, but looking at the reader and just looking with like badass, like and with just vengeance, and he's ready to get on with it. So stuff like that, I really enjoyed that episode, for that reason. So
yeah, I think it
issue. I'm sorry, I did it again. Episode, damn it.
I mean, they're episodes in their own way. It's all right.
They are,
it's
but
fine.
Just so damn conditioned.
So that sort of brings the battle for the Fall of Metropolis to a close. Again, I do think it is a satisfying conclusion. We, at least in these issues, we never get a firm answer on what caused the clone plague, right? We only have Hamilton's theory about the water when the tunnel was flooded. I don't know if this comes back later and there's more to it or not.
I think that was it. We're just going to have to be happy with that for some reason.
I mean, it definitely tracks because everyone who was afflicted was in the tunnels, right? Like the Newsboy Legion, they're afflicted by this because it's not every single clone. And ultimately it's the Guardian, Jim Harper, whose blood they're able to use to extract the serum before Cadmus is seemingly destroyed. And we don't get a follow up on that in these issues either.
No, Cadmus is, I thought, and this is just a general thought, Cadmus was at this time just there for the way to explain things away. It wasn't later on Cadmus became more of an entity that had some weight to it. It didn't really that's why you don't see a big explanation what happened to Cadmus and it's not like this shadow organization really pulling the strings and experimenting with some real major stuff that they would later on down the road. They were just there for convenience. What happened here? Well, it's Cadmus. So
yeah, well, we'll keep an eye on that as we make our way forward through the next episodes to see what becomes of Cadmus. Again, I know they continue on. I just don't remember exactly the circumstances. Maybe it's after 0 Hour, I guess, where maybe that helped account for their survival / return. I don't know.
Yeah, that and this little alien creature that would follow Superboy around.
Oh yeah, Double X.
Double X. Jesus, that one annoyed me.
Aw.
I don't know. It just. Yeah.
Now, there was also, in the midst of all of this, we did have 2 issues of Man of Steel that tied into the Worlds Collide event. Now, this saw Superman interact with the milestone characters like Icon and Static Shock. I did not read all parts of Worlds Collide then or now, so only reading these couple of issues in a vacuum didn't quite do much for me. I don't know. Do you have an attachment to any of those milestone characters?
Only really Static Shock, and it's just from watching the cartoons.
Yeah.
I at the time reading it, I wasn't aware of Milestone. So they were just other characters. I'm like, oh well, I don't really know what their deal is, but I know there's something behind there. And it wasn't until years later that I saw Static Shock and I learned more about the character, and it wasn't until probably more recent issues of comics where they would retcon Static in some way, shape, or form, and really made him a much more compelling character. But beyond that, I didn't really draw my interest too much. So
I hear you. I'll be honest, what I was more interested in reading these issues, again, going back to the supporting cast, who I feel like did get the short end of the stick during this leg that we've been talking about. But Keith, the young character who Superman has saved a few times, his adoptive mother, or the woman who runs, I guess, the orphanage where he's staying, right, Myra, is killed, and this will set up the storyline where Perry and Alice take Keith in and adopt him. So that comes to pass here, not in these issues specifically, but in this general area. Emil Hamilton loses his arm, which I had forgotten happens here. So there's a few other pieces as we're moving forward here, but I touched on the massacre battle earlier, so that happens at this point as well. But then the last few issues that we read tied into 0 Hour. So 0 Hour, Crisis in Time was the 1994 miniseries. The first Crisis event after Crisis on Infinite Earths. I did a podcast series in 2021 called My Comic Shop Book Club, and we did 12 episodes, and the last one was on 0 Hour. So not too long ago, I read the whole thing. We had a discussion about that, but essentially it was born out of this idea that Dan Jurgens had, because he talks about this in the introduction to the hardcover, where he was drawing an issue of Green Arrow, and Ollie was celebrating his 45th birthday, and it got him thinking, like, well, okay, if Ollie is this old, what does this mean for the rest of the DC universe, right? And I guess in the aftermath of Crisis on Infinite Earths, there were other issues like this, some things that didn't quite line up, that DC felt this would be an opportunity to address. And so this led to the weekly 0 Hour event. And during that month, every DC title tied into it. So, of course, our 4 Superman titles that we're reading each had an issue tying into 0 Hour. So in the Man of Steel issue, Superman's meeting all these different iterations of Batman, including the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns version. Yeah. We have another issue where we have an intersection with the timeline where Krypton didn't explode and Jor-El and Lara are there. So things like that are going on. What is your take on this, on the 0 Hour event and the way that it unfolds in these Superman issues?
I loved 0 Hour. So I again, I love 0 Hour. However, I was a little annoyed at the whole, this guy's the bad guy. No, it's this guy's the bad guy. No, it's it's Parallax. Fine, that's cool. That's Parallax. Because I love Parallax. I love Green Lantern. I love the series because at the time I wasn't too satiated with major events in comics. And again, it was somewhat like reverb from Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I like anytime they break out the linear men.
Yes.
I love those characters. And they're the ones, they're the types of characters that if they're coming up or if they're making an appearance, something's going down. So I like when they're around. The Superman tie-ins didn't really wow me so much, other than the Batman stuff, because I don't think in actuality Superman would have been all that broken up about okay, his biological parents are here, but then they left and he flew after them. I don't think Superman really would have done that. He's a little bit more logical and practical. He would have known all right, something's up, I'm not going to go after them. But just to see all those versions of Batman together was just awesome. Well, no, I guess it was after that. So I won't touch on Conduit. So that I won't touch on that.
Yeah, Conduit's coming up in our next episode, in part 3 of Death Till Wedding. I'll be welcoming back returning guest Bernie Gersmeyer, and we'll be talking about the next chunk of the Triangle era. We'll be looking at the 0 month issues, where each of these titles had a number 0. And we get the origin of Kenny Braverman, a.k.a. Conduit. I've been singing Conduit's praises on this podcast for a long time.
I love Conduit.
But I've not yet reread those issues. So I hope that it holds up. I don't know yet. But we'll be covering 0 month and the Dead Again arc and a few other issues as well. So that's coming up, and I am excited to get into that and to see how this holds up, because I remember Conduit very fondly, and I feel like this is a character. I know there's been some play recently in the Philip Kennedy Johnson Action Comics. I won't spoil anything, but I think that, for a long time, this character was off the board, and it was always kind of puzzling to me.
I agree with you 100%. I was, like they have brought back so many other characters or versions of characters. Like, why have they waited so long? Because this was an original character. This was new. He has roots. It's like Hush.
Yep.
To Batman. It's Superman's Hush. He has roots to Clark Kent when he was a child, who is now grown to adulthood and has, powers that can, match Superman's. And, he has like a genuine, legitimate beef with him. Like it makes sense. Why haven't they, why wait so long?
It's very puzzling. I haven't really read ahead yet, but I was just kind of looking at covers and looking at the design of Conduit. I said to myself, oh, I think I know why I like the character. Kind of has like a Power Ranger vibe to him with that helmet. Right. And I know you're a fellow fan, and here's a quick plug. We have our Power Rangers podcast, Summoning the Zords, which comes out monthly, and Joe's going to be a guest on an upcoming episode. But I feel like that has something to do with it. Now, like, it makes so much sense now. I was looking at the design. I was like, oh, that's probably why I liked it so much.
Yeah, he's a really cool. I mean, like it. I got excited when I read past 0 Hour so I can get into those again, because I remember buying that figure.
Yep, I have it right on the table behind me.
Nice.
But as far as 0 Hour goes. And again, I have a whole episode on it on my Comic Shop Book Club if anyone wants to check it out. There's a lot of nostalgia there for me because that was the first Crisis event that I was, reading comics, when it happened. So, it holds a special place. And of course, it's Jurgens, it's Ordway. It's, it wasn't a Superman event, but it was done by two very prominent Superman creators. So, there's that. I too, I know this will be controversial for certain Hal Jordan fans, but I liked the Parallax turn. He had a really interesting arc across these events from 0 Hour to Final Night to Day of Judgment. It was quite the arc for Hal Jordan over those events. And
there's always this connection to the Spectre.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's why I always sing Jeff Johns' praises, because he's a man who does his homework. And he will reference things that happen in one panel of an issue, 20 years ago. The fact that he brought Necron back as a legitimate, character, and he was just more or less a throwaway. Because when I found out, like, that where he was in, Green Lantern lore prior to Blackest Night, I went searching. And I found out, I'm like, really? He was really only in one issue for 2-3 pages. And he was nowhere near as badass as he was in Blackest Night. So that's why I always appreciate things that, Jeff Johns writes for, because like he just like, I would love to see his notebook, because like he is making notes and highlighting stuff left and right. I could tell, because like, it just makes for a compelling story. So I don't know what the hell. Right.
No. I got you. I mean, yeah. I mean, again, as far as 0 Hour itself, like I said, I don't know how well it necessarily holds up for me, at least, but I have fond memories of reading it as a kid. And these tie-in issues, the Batman one was cool, especially to see Bogdanove do his version of Frank Miller's Batman. It was really cool. That was a strong issue. The Jor-El and Lara issue for me was the most resonant, but not because of the Jor-El and Lara piece, but because of the Kent piece of it. And, you get to see, that dynamic and to see Clark show his appreciation for the fact that he comes back to tell them, how much he loves them and to thank them for what they did. So I enjoyed that piece of it. At the end of the day, these are, tie-in issues to a huge event. But, there's some interesting stuff in there. And, again, next episode, we'll get into 0 Month, where we deal with the aftermath of 0 Hour and sort of get the lay of the land after all of this. And like we said, get the introduction of Kenny Braverman. I'll say this. I know I've said this on some podcast before, but the end of the Action Comics issue, the last 0 Hour tie-in, when the pages fade to white, And I know all of the tie-in comics, or I guess that week did, right? Because that's what was happening in that issue of Zero Hour that week.
Right. It was
where the timeline was being undone. I remember getting that issue at Dragon's Den comic book store in Cross County in New York. And I remember like my mom took me there, we got the comic, and then I think we were in the car or whatever, and I was flipping through it, and I hadn't, not having read the whole thing and understanding the context, we just saw that it looked like there was a printing error because it was so white at the end.
What the hell? Ma, turn around.
And we went back into the store and the guy explained it as best as I can recall. I think he was nice about it. I'm sure they had commentary about it after we left, but I will always remember that. I will always remember getting that issue, be like, there's something wrong. It's a printing error, but it wasn't. And again, when you read it, it makes sense in the context, but without the context, it was just like, hey, what the hell?
Ran out of ink or something. I don't know what's going on here.
Listen.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Thank you so much for doing this reading project and coming on here. Any parting thoughts on what we read before we sign off?
I will say kind of what I mentioned at first. I think the Triangle era, beyond what we just discussed, it was a great period for people to jump into because it was very easily connected. However, each title was independent of the others. So they had their own, storylines, but each storyline tied in well together. And, there's some great content in there. It's great stuff. It was great revisiting this because I hadn't read these issues in ages. I mean, I've read Zero Hour and the big events because they're kind of like my go-tos. But all the stuff in between, it made me, really explore it and appreciate it. So thank you.
Awesome. No, I appreciate you coming along. I enjoyed the conversation so much. I enjoyed the reading well enough as well. I think I found it, lacking in instances more than I expected to or more than I hoped to, but that's okay. That happens sometimes. This was so much fun to talk about. I'm looking forward to getting into the next part of the Triangle era. You'll be back in a few episodes. I've got you lined up for another one.
Yeah.
So I look forward to doing this with you again. Of course, everyone should check out Dollar Bin Bandits podcast, wherever you get podcasts or watch on YouTube. Follow along on social media, Dollar Bin Banter Facebook group as well, correct?
Yeah, there's all kinds of social media stuff. Dollar Bin Bandits on YouTube, DB Bandits on, Twitter and some other stuff. I don't read Twitter. But look, we're there. You know where to find it.
Yeah. And
iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts.
Great interviews with creators, again, including a lot of the creators whose work we've been talking about. So I hope people will check that out. I hope you'll keep tuning in to Death Till Wedding. We're 2 chapters in. We still have a lot more to go. Like I said, next time, Bernie will be back and we'll be talking about 0 Month and Dead Again. So it should be a really interesting one. As always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the show and receive exclusive additional content, including my DC Movie Rewatch podcast, at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show. Also, be sure to explore the other shows within the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, which is home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, all hosted by yours truly. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts. Visit flatsquirrelproductions.com for more. Thank you all.